Hi, I'm Frank Coleman, the Bureau Chief for the Secret Agent Project, and this is another one of the in-depth behind the music, behind the scenes investigations into the individual tracks on the debut album from Secret Agent entitled Declassified, which was released worldwide on it was October 15th, 2020. So today we're going to take a look at track number 6, which is Berlin. And Berlin had a long and complex coming into being gestation period. And at about halfway through, I just stopped and wiped the slate clean and just started completely from scratch. In terms of the arrangement, I kept the basic song idea. I liked the chord pattern that I'd come up with, but I wanted a lot more energy. So I jacked up the tempo by some 20 odd ticks. And I'll show you A and B, where it started and where it ended up, and we can talk about some of the internals and what the hell I was thinking. So anyway, this right here is the first version, the earliest version I've been able to find. Some of the tracks on Secret Agent, some of the other tracks started and ended as constructs of Apple loops. Some were composed completely played actually in real time by me, and some were a mishmash of the two. I thought that I had started this one with loops, but looking at it now, looking at this one, it all appears to be actually played. Anyway, here's how it started life. I wanted something sort of dancey, and by the time I was done putting it all together, I didn't think it had enough energy. But here's how it started anyway. Again, with this sort of telemetry idea. This was a fairly early on composition after Buenos Aires and Washington, D.C., but you gotta try to get that sort of feeling of like a highway at night. And also a little bit of a nod to Kraftwerk. Actually, hang on a second here. Let me take a look at some of this. Doesn't sound quite right. Yeah, that is the basic. That's the basic chord progression of the song. Right, and then what else we got here? Yeah, okay. But something sounds a little weird. Let me see what this thing is doing. That's the beat. What's this? Oh, okay. So this is on the. It sounds like it's on the wrong patch. I think this is supposed to actually be a grand piano sound. Not like that. But you know what? I'm gonna just mute this now because that isn't even really necessarily an important part. Especially since the real interesting stuff is where it ended up going. So anyway, here we go. Again, it sounds like something's wrong. I haven't opened up this version of this in a very, very long time. Like 6 years. So it's possible that things have gotten remapped to weird places. Let's see what else we got here. Yeah, that melodic figure ended up in a different voice in the real version, the one that we ended up with. Let's see what's Anyway, so you get the idea, kind of slightly hip-hop-y, electro, blah, 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 you know, but it was just this kind of thing. So, yeah, I eventually arrived at a point where I found myself dissatisfied with this. And this is what it eventually turned into. Give us a second here. All right, let's take it from the top. I have to crank this up a little bit. It's turned down because it was for mastering. So it's going to be -6. Bring this up a little bit.
It is the story, the true story, the world forgot. And the story isn't finished yet.
So you can hear how that kind of sinister motif, you know, got brought over, you know, from the other one into this. So this is Logic, and I'm not going to go into a lot of in-depth stuff about the internals of Logic because there's other videos for that. But basically, each one of these rows corresponds to a different voice, if you will, or a different part in the overall mix of what goes together. So this whole batch up here, all this stuff, these are all dialogue tracks, and I think actually goes all the way down. Actually, yeah, all the way down to this one. Those are all individual dialogue tracks from a whole boatload of different movies and stuff. And each one of them needed different EQ and different this and different that, a little, you know, because they all come from drastically different sources, and a lot of them are like from VHS or worse, you know, like really kind of beat up and needed to be brought up or have certain frequencies brought up so that they would be intelligible in the context of a music piece. And so each one required its own bit of TLC, so that's why they're all on different tracks, but they all come together down to a in the mixer here. Let's see, let's open this up. This corresponds to all the tracks we were just looking at here. These are all those dialogue tracks. I've got them highlighted right here because I have them selected up here, up in the upper window. And they all come down. They all end up on one fader down here. And this governs the master volume for all of them. And this is the master fader for all the drum parts and the percussion, which is the drum box and bass, guitar, and its bassy sounds and strings and guitars and stuff like that. And it all finally comes down to one big master fader that gives us our mix. And along the way we add salt and pepper and paprika and delay and compression and EQ and stuff like that. And that's how the sausage gets made. That's how music comes together. So let's take this from the top here. Let's start with the drum thing, and then we get into the...
It is the story, the true story, the world forgot. And the story isn't finished yet.
Yeah, I kind of felt like at this point in the album and at this point in my life, when this was all coming together, I kind of felt like putting some of the cards on the table.
Working as a spy in Berlin.
So a couple of things. That soundbite and the plot explained, yeah. That soundbite and not the Spy in Berlin one. That came from something fairly contemporary. Honestly, I can't remember. It was like, well, I'll come back to that one. So the first one, that's the true story the world forgot. You know, working a man who planned to conquer the world and all like that. Those samples come from a film. I believe that's from Foreign Intrigue with Robert Mitchum, 1956. And it's on YouTube. And I really like the writer. The writer on that also worked on a film called Assignment to Kill, and a lot of samples from that film ended up in Zurich, in the Zurich track on this album. So one of the things about getting movie dialogue samples to use in this project is I have a vast collection of movies. My wife and I probably have 20,000 titles. But apart from that, I don't just off the top of my head have every line of dialogue memorized, but there are databases online where you can, type in a phrase or a word or whatever, and it will give you every movie and every TV episode of whatever that has ever used that line of dialogue ever that they have in their database, which is extensive. The best one is something called Subzin.com. Subzin.com. And let's see here. Subzin.com. And find quotes in movies and whatever. If I type in Berlin and search, then it gives me 8,081, just over 8,100 instances of the word Berlin. And it shows me the movie and where the line of dialogue is and when it happens in the movie. So if I have the movie in my collection, I can just go pull out the file and go look for where it says. So that very often that's why I would do it. But, I would avoid stuff like Casablanca, the obvious stuff, I would try to go after really obscure things. So I think working as a spy in Berlin, this thing may have been, I honestly, I've completely forgotten. But it was something, I think it was something fairly modern, this one. Most of this stuff was, 50s and 60s. That line, I think, may have come from like an episode of Burn Notice or something. De minimis. Anyway, so let's listen in some more here and see what happens.
Working as a spy in Berlin.
With a man who planned to conquer the world.
Okay, so in the space of the first minute here, we've gone from minimal techno to like this kind of punky, thrashy thing. And I should also say that when I started off redoing this song, one of my motivations was to give it what's called a motorik beat. And the motorik beat, M-O-T-O-R-I-K, comes from a band called New, N-E-U, New. I'm not German. I'm sorry. I'm mangling their name, but with an exclamation point. And their song Hallo Gallo, in particular, which was sort of like the freebird of what was called krautrock back in the 60s, a mishmash of progressive rock and experimental psychedelia and electronics that sort of was the sort of tributary that came from progressive rock and then eventually kind of morphed into like Kraftwerk, who were leading progenitors of the style, not just influences. And Kraftwerk in turn provided the seeds that led to hip hop. Planet Rock, the first really big mainstream hip hop hit, was a couple of Kraftwerk songs mushed together, Numbers and Trans-Europe Express. But be that as it may, so what happens here is started off with drumbo, doing this electronica beat, and then live drums kick in here, and that's me playing live drums. And those tracks were actually like recorded in my basement when I lived in Needham, Massachusetts, and I had a drum set set up there, and it just two mics in the room, so it's just the whole kit, me playing the whole thing. That's it. I don't think it ever existed as individual tracks, and everything just bleeds into everything else, which is part of what I like about the sound too. Is it's big and trashy, and so there you go. So
Berlin.
Now, I love these kinds of breaks like here. I also did one similar in Madrid too, where it reminds me of I don't know, like Hullabaloo, of like these kiddie shows where like you know, or I don't know, it was like, they do this on American Bandstand where they're like, the camera would like, wah, zooming in and out, wah, 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 like, you know. It just feels very sort of mod 60s, you know, kind of, that sort of feels what I'm going for. The drums, just the whole drum set through is crazy slap back delay business. That's what you get.
With a man who planned to. Powerful.
See, I doubled up the bass there. This will be big and fat. I'm a bass fanatic. I can never get enough bass. Now, the other thing that I added in here is Fender Rhodes, and again, over the course of this project, I just fell more and more in love with the Fender Rhodes sound. Some of that, I mean, I always loved Fender Rhodes and played one in high school. It's an incredibly versatile instrument, really. And here I've got a whole bunch of stuff going on. It's being put through an amp that looks like this, with this mic on, a condenser 87 mic and a Blackface 4x10 amp simulator, and it's got some EQ on it, and there's some EQ on it to really bring out the edge, and then it's got a digital delay as well, an eighth note thing happening. So when you put it all together, let's solo this. If I take off the delay, and it's also got some effects on it as well. Tape delay and reverb and stuff like that. So it's got a lot of business going on to really give it this rich sound, and I just love how it just kind of like curls around all the rest of the other sounds.
I followed you.
Why?
I told you I was hired to follow you.
Who's the man who's paying you to follow me?
Don't be silly, I can't tell you that.
Yeah, that is from Foreign Intrigue as well. That guy shows up in a few places. This business bag here.
A man who was wealthy, a man who was powerful, a man who would sell his country for more power.
A man who is wealthy, a man who is powerful, a man who would sell his country for more power.
I followed you.
Why?
I told you I was hired to follow you.
Who's the man who's paying you to follow me?
Don't be silly, I can't tell you that.
Yeah, and that's this guitar sound that I developed over the course of doing this project, and I really like where I got this thing now. Now, of course, if you listen to it solo like this, it sounds like it's got way too much delay on it. But when you put it in the context of the overall track, some of that gets eaten up.
These are the men who made the deals, the men the world knows.
It's one keyboard, folks. It's just this. Everything you hear is all coming from right here and right here. That's all it is. It's just a keyboard. And let's see, go in here, and it's a Sunburst electric guitar sound. All this jazz here going on. That's the source of the sound. Here, let me put this up here. Listen to a little loop here. What just focus in on this for a minute. And I'll undo these elements and then I'll add them back in so you can hear what each one does to the sound. Let's start with it. Just turn these 5 things off. That's what it starts with. Then we add a compressor, which just gives it more attack and makes it, kind of fills out the sound. What it does, it makes the softer parts a little louder so that they're like, without fucking with the dynamics too much, it enables you to hear all the articulation. Then we get into the amp. Now this has got a British gain amp here. I don't know if you can see this, but it's got a British gain for the amp. For the speaker, it's got a UK 412 thing and a what they call a modern EQ. It's a nice sounding preset, so I went with it. Then we add in tape delay. Let me take off. That thing you just hear what the tape delay does by itself. You see the dry signal, which is just the signal by itself, is actually knocked back a little bit here. I don't know why I did that. And then there's EQ, which gives us more richness in the, gives us more body in the lower mid, and also some more edge up and towards the upper mid range there.
Fortunate that we are working together.
They have their 5-year plans. So have I.
It's from The Third Man. That's Orson Welles. They have their 5-year plans. So have I. Who's famous for 5-year plans? Do you know your history?
And these men remain today, waiting as they waited before.
I can only spell it out so much. This next part is one of my favorite bits.
How long will you be there?
I'll be there until I hear from you or until I don't.
Yeah. I'll be there until I hear from you or until I don't. I saw that as being sort of a sideways slap at friggin' conspiracy theorists and nitwit, QAnon people. People just, they're going to do their thing regardless of whether, the truth supports it or not, Guitar.
And we must be extremely cautious.
And the other thing that I added in here, it comes in earlier too as well, is this clavinet thing. Right, so this has, here, let's solo this for a minute here. Let's take a look at this. And again, I'm going to take off these things here and you hear what it sounds like. That's how it starts. If I, hang on, if we take a look at this part here, that's it, right? It's just this little dinky part. And then let's start adding in, let's put this on here so we can hear it a little better. I actually left off the tape to play this other thing here. This gives a little extra goose here. This is this thing called the Ion Pusher. It's actually from Infected Mushroom, who they do some remixers and stuff who I really like. And they made their own plug-in here. And it worked really well for this. And then this has got some extra outboard stuff here. It's got like a small room delay, and then it's got this here, which is what is this one? This is the lead effects. There's lots of effects stacked up on this. Right, well there you go.
And we must be extremely cautious.
You'll be in the greatest possible danger. He's a professional spy. You'll be in the greatest possible danger. He's a professional spy.
Now, okay, so what happens here? Well, first of all, we have these two dialogue samples here repeated, and this is, I've talked about this before, about the notion of taking dialogue and trying to make it almost take the place, not really take the place, but serve the function of lyrics. And that was a modus operandi, and it gets all behind a lot of this whole album. But so that too, I believe, is from Foreign Intrigue, and I think it's maybe the only place on the album where I actually say the word spy. But it felt like I really wanted to kind of drive that concept home right here. The strings, the strings that come in here, this whole, it's actually repeated twice. This whole thing is like the ending music at the end of Foreign Intrigue, as it's a very strange movie. And at the end, the guy walks off with his co-conspirator instead of with the girl. But they yeah, it's just the music at the end of the movie, and I just dropped it in, just like, and the way it landed was just perfect. And so when you drop it in, it sounds like, pick it up from here, it sounds like the whole harmonic center kind of shifts. It's something like the world tilting on its axis. So here we go.
Don't be a fool.
How many times have you heard that line in a film? Don't be a fool. So it just seemed like the way to cap this off. Anyway, so that is Berlin, and hope you've been enjoying this series. I've been doing them out of sequence, and this was the next to last complicated one. The most complicated one is Buenos Aires, which is the song that actually started it all off, and still kind of the magnum opus of the whole thing, and that's going to take some explaining. Anyway, hope you enjoyed this, and onward.